Welcome to the Conscious Corner. I've been obsessed with consciousness my whole life. I'm not sure why. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it's going. I don't know where it's been, but we'll figure it out together. In today's episode, let's talk about objective versus subjective. I cannot understate how important this concept is. No matter what we do, no matter how much philosophy, physics, psychology, no matter what we learn about the universe, this concept will always be there, and it'll always govern the outcome. It'll always govern the results that we seek. Humans have an inbuilt tendency to want to know, the philosophy of unknownism. We search for absolute truths. We search for things that we find comfort in. We want to explain things. This is human nature. But we keep bumping up against the universe. And what we keep bumping up against is the objective versus the subjective. Why? Because the whole reason that we are human is our physical capabilities, our cognition, our prefrontal cortex, our bodies, our sensory perception. These all combined makes us human. And we're much more similar than we think. Our DNA structure is 99% plus the same. It's the gene expression that gives us our characteristics. But what I'm trying to say is physically, yes, height and all that, there's the differences. But the way we intake reality and the way that we construct reality in our brains, there's not a lot of variation. While psychologically there's a lot of variation. I'm not saying we don't have different personalities. I'm trying to get to some objectiveness of the way that we experience the universe. And that, when we're talking about the electromagnetic waves and the frequency range, I think it's like 400 to 700 nanohertz, that gives us our color spectrum and the way that we see light and the way that we can start to understand the universe. That is roughly very, very similar. Of course, you got edge cases of people that just their physical brain works differently, which allows them to experience reality differently. And you could also chemically induce a different construction of reality through some kind of pharmaceutical and other drugs. But in the steady state and over the course of human history, we have experienced the universe fairly similar. And that's where I want to talk about the objective versus the subjective. And if you go down a philosophical rabbit hole and jump into metaphysics, the whole goal of metaphysics is to explain what is the true nature of reality. It's asking the same question. Another way to ask the question is, if we weren't here to subjectively experience the universe the way that we do, what would be out there? What would the universe look like? One day we might be able to get out of our senses and have an objective lens to the universe, but for now we're stuck. And why I say we're stuck is because we have now a branch of philosophy. It all started in philosophy, called physics and science. The whole goal of science is to give us the objectiveness, to give us laws, mathematics, to give us empirical data and repetition of experiments so that we can understand the universe, at least from the physics point of view. And it's amazing. I really do love the theories. The quantum field theory, quantum mechanics is fascinating on its own. But there is a big open question around the boundary of the objectiveness and the subjectiveness. The reason being is every experiment we run, every time we do anything in life, this is the premise of life, there is a subjectiveness element to it. Even though we get objective results through any of the experiments we run, we are doing it subjectively. We now have certain tools that allows us to go beyond our senses. And what I mean by that is we can now detect atoms, for instance, and that we, with the use of technology, can see things that our eyes would never be able to see. But even that is an experience. Even the fact that we're using those tools is a subjective experience. Every moment of my life is a conscious inference, and I am a sum of all my conscious inferences. That's what defines the self. But each conscious inference has a level of subjectivity to it. That subjectivity is my thoughts, my feelings, my interpretations, my meanings, how it affected me. That's all part of it. And these are the memories that I store. So now we're moving on to the more epistemological debates of empiricism versus rationalism. And the empirist part is exactly that. They talk about impressions, I call them conscious inferences. But everything in life is something that we learn. And what are we doing as humans? We're having more and more experiences. The whole point of going through time is learning more, is experiencing more. And it's not just we're learning because we're going and reading books or watching videos. I'm just talking about every single moment of life. Regardless of whether I've had that type of moment before, it's still a new experience. Something is ever so slightly different day to day. Although I'm in the same physical space, same apartment, same table we talked about before, time has moved. There was an old expression, a person never sets foot in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and it's not the same person. So here we are having all of these subjective experiences, and that's what makes us human. And every human has had the same, I wouldn't say the same, but the same type of experiences. As in, they've constructed their reality for their place in space-time, and that reality they've stored as a conscious inference. So if there wasn't subjectiveness to our experience, what would be out there? What's the universe look like without us subjectively experiencing it? And if we're constructing reality, how much of reality do we construct? I've been fascinated by this topic for a while and a long time, and I've seen and heard a lot of information about this. And I guess the conclusion that I came to is, yeah, we construct a lot of our reality. I do believe that time is an experience of humans, and it's to do with the macro versus the micro, which is very akin to the objective versus subjective. There's something happening at our energy level as humans that we don't see when we look at the micro world. We have the ability now to take a glimpse, and quantum mechanics and the experiments we run allow us to do this. But even there are mysteries around how things operate and what the gap is between micro and macro. To give you an example, we have a boundary of our physical experience and our working fundamental laws of physics, and that's the Planck length. The Planck length of physical reality is 10 to the negative 34. To give you a guide, an atom is around 10 to the negative 17. So there's a big gap between the subatomic particles that we can measure and run science against versus the underpinning physical boundary of our senses. Everything breaks down at the Planck length. And what that means is we can only go so small with our sensory perception, but something is happening underneath. Something happens beyond that we just will never have access to. Never say never. We might evolve to have access to this, but unfortunately, physical evolution takes billions of years. However, our mental evolution can move faster. I believe the whole goal of developing minds and prefrontal cortexes and the fact that we can think is to evolve our mental space faster than we can our physical space. And if you look at the evidence of the years, it's been happening individually. I think we're just able to intake more information now or understand more. Collectively, as humans, as a society, we learn and learn and learn. And our mental evolution is fueling our technological evolution. We're thinking of different things, of creative things. We now have such amazing tools. We have amazing technology. We also have amazing thoughts around quantum mechanics, like I said, and physics and quantum field theory. This is the leading theory in physics to explain the universe. But the gaps that we have are still here. And one of the gaps in quantum mechanics is the measurement problem, which is exactly almost the subjective versus objective that we're talking about. There is something happens that we measure at the quantum level where there's probabilistic distributions of particles. It's a probability, it's a wave. And at some point, something happened that collapses, that it becomes what we experience as fixed particles. How we go from the micro to the macro, that is really the big mystery of physics when we talk about the measurement problem. If you heard of things like Schrodinger's cat, this is highlighting that there's something happening at the micro level, and that's not even at the level that we can't experience. It's the one that we can, that emerges, and I want to use this term now, emerges into the macro. There is a step function. There is a transformation that happens to give us this experience of life. And even Einstein, past general relativity, spent most of his later years trying to explain what that step function is. The leading theory, especially with the measurement problem, is that the Copenhagen interpretation, that it just happens. There's a collapse. There's something that happens at the quantum level that when we start to interact with that environment, it collapses into the reality we know. And switching to philosophy, we've been talking about this as well. And people like John Locke, who started proposing that there was primary and secondary qualities. And the goal of philosophy was to find the boundary of where our senses start and where objective reality starts. And where is that? And Immanuel Kant, another famous philosopher, talked about transcendental idealism, where the noumena is out there. We have the phenomenological experience. And he was one of the first people then to stipulate that it's our brain that has the framework to construct life, as opposed to objectiveness being out in the world. Our brain is creating the experience of life. And these weren't the only two philosophers that have been talking. Almost every philosopher in some way ends up talking about objective versus subjective, especially if they're trying to explain metaphysics. Even the epistemological debates that have happened, the empiricists, I should say, talk about everything in life is an impression. I call it a conscious inference, but they're similar for the purposes of this discussion. That everything in life, from the beginning of the time that we're conscious and when we're born, all the way to the end of our life, everything is that conscious inference. We have a moment in time that we store as a memory that is the thoughts and feelings and experience of life. And everything that's just it. There's nothing implanted in us. There's nothing that predetermined knowledge that we have. We go through life, and with these experiences, we build our own reality. I do believe we carry across our reality with us throughout our lives, and that changes. Why? I'm not saying the physical reality that we experience changes, but the way we see the world and ourselves and our psychology and what we use our minds for change over the course of our lives. It's very hard to disambiguate what we feel inside and who we are from how we experience the world. Because the whole point of a conscious inference is, in some ways, the phenomenological experience of life that we have is integrated. Our physical integration in our brains happens before we even are conscious of it. In some cases, people have said consciousness goes along for the ride, and our brains and the electrochemicals are going to always do what they're going to do. There's no tracking them or there's no deviating them, and our consciousness just experiences life for us. And that's fascinating to think about as well. And it doesn't really help with the objective versus subjective, but it is an interesting thing that maybe we just going along, maybe our brains are the primary driver. Maybe it's physical things that are driving us, and consciousness sort of is just, there. A lot of people have talked about different types of experiences in life. We have the skeptics, the philosophical skeptics. On one extreme, there was a philosopher called Pyrrho that basically believed a reality didn't exist. That is an extreme case, and it's hard to ration and reason about, so it's interesting. Descartes was also a skeptist, I should say. Was it Cartesian skepticism? Either way, he doubted the senses. The whole "I think, therefore I am," probably the most famous quote in philosophy, came about because he questioned the senses. He couldn't trust any of the senses that he had, and therefore the only thing he thought was an absolute was the fact that he was thinking. The fact that he was questioning it itself was the one thing that he could hold true. Now that opened the massive door, the second coming of philosophy, because it turned all the metaphysical debates into the epistemological ones, and basically introduced dualism, the concept that our mind and consciousness is different from the physical workings of our body. This is why it's called dualism. Now that poses interesting questions to objective versus subjective, because if dualism is right, therefore there's something out there objectively, but we are experiencing it without something that's physical. And that is like, okay, so if it's not physical, what is it? Which is a big drawback of dualism. It's very hard to explain something that's non-physical. But to be fair, we haven't physically explained the mind or consciousness yet either. So we don't understand how we construct reality. We don't actually understand the experience of life that we have. And all the empiricists, when they talk about this, we can explain those experiences. We can explain the subjectiveness. We can talk about what they are. We can't explain how they physically work. You may be shocked at this point. Well, I may be shocked at this point because this point always shocks me. We don't have a physical explanation from a neuroscientific point of view of emotion or feelings or memories for that instance. How could we not understand how memories work? We do understand that each of our neurons has a capability to store information. That's the engram part of the neuron. But we can't exactly explain that this region of the brain or this group of neurons is responsible for these types of experiences or the experiences that I've had. And so if we can't physically explain a lot of the subjectiveness, what are we left with? If we can't explain how our brain constructs reality, then what really, where do we go from here? We have to start leaning on some of the other intuitions that we have. Quantum field theory is an amazing and the most advanced theory we have to date to explain the universe. But that's based on a few core principles. And one of those principles is symmetry. The symmetry of the quantum field itself allows the conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and the particles to behave the way that they do. Symmetry seems to be one of the most important aspects of our physical reality. What is symmetry? If you take an object or a group of objects and do some sort of transformation and rotation on them, and they look the same or they have the same characteristics after you've done that, then you found a symmetry. And in the physics world, this is super fascinating because if you look at a lot of what underpins the laws that we can go and explain, it's symmetries. And it kind of holds true when you say energy cannot be created or destroyed. The second law of thermodynamics is exactly this, or is it it's one of the laws. So the first, one of it is entropy always increases. Maybe the first law of thermodynamics. Either way, energy cannot be created or destroyed, which points to the fact that maybe it's the same energy. Maybe all we're doing is transforming that energy because of those symmetries, but that's what's happening at the objective level. Objectiveness, there's a bunch of energy, and we know that energy is a big important part of life. We are physically involved to essentially transfer energy from the sun into mechanical movement and into mental power to do exactly what we do. Life is about energy. The universe is about energy. That energy gets transformed, whether it gets transformed. And when we look at things like special relativity, we can see that the amount of energy governs the mass. It governs a lot of the things of the physical properties. The underpinning is that energy. What is energy? That is one of the most fascinating questions I can ever ask. Now, we define energy as the ability to do work, but that's a characteristic of energy. That's not energy itself. I don't think we have a good definition of energy itself. We can only define how it behaves. So the best that we can run with is the noumena. What's really out there is a bunch of energy. And what the energy does is it transforms and takes shape depending on the person who's subjectively experiencing it. And the way that subjectiveness happens with the way that they interpret that energy and see that energy is how we experience life. It sounds very hand-wavy, and there's many layers in between, actually. But at the end of the day, that may be it. And the only way we would know, this is interesting, is if we could ask some of the animals. We know that the animals have evolved to experience life differently because their brains have evolved differently. Do they feel and experience the world exactly like we do? I doubt it. I think there's slight variation of their subjective experience of the universe. Unfortunately, we can't ask them to look into a telescope and tell us what they see. That's not exactly a practical thing to do. We can't even ask them of how they're feeling. We can't ask them about their consciousness. This is why consciousness itself is a fascinating topic, because consciousness is that term for the experience of life where they're happening. The integration, the richness, the colors, the sounds, the feelings, all of that is defined and through our consciousness. We can never step into another person's consciousness, let alone step into an animal's consciousness. So experiencing life as something else is impossible. So their life is relative. These concepts in philosophy, I feel I end up where I started. There's definitely circular references that happen. Everything leads to the same things. And when we talk about objective versus subjective, I've talked about relative versus absolutes before. You could akin the objective to the absolute. The absolute truth is this is how the universe is. The relative truth is how we experience the universe, what it means to us, what we integrate the sense of reality into. And so I guess to try and summarize or wrap up, which I think I'm just going to make a part 2 because I like talking about this topic. I think not enough people talk about this topic. When I see and hear things of people explaining, whether that be physics or philosophy or even psychology, we underestimate how important it is to understand that there is an objectiveness and a subjectiveness to things. And what's in between emerges. What we experience of life is emergent properties of the universe. And that emergence through our senses is what we are gated by, is what we're bound by. And that matters because we start talking about concepts and ideas in our minds. We talk about things like meaning. What is the meaning of these words that we're using? What is the meaning of our capabilities? And in reality, these are constructs. And going back to an important part of it is information. We talked about information storage in our brains, in memories. The way that we interpret the information of the universe is what's presented to us by the universe in some ways. I think because of this, what people end up doing is they're trying to explain something objectively where in reality they've mixed in the subjectiveness. It's very hard to disambiguate the two when you're trying to explain things. And so keeping this in mind helps us give a bit of a framework, and we can identify when we're trying to explain something, we're really explaining the subjectiveness of it. And therefore, it's not an absolute. It's not something fixed. It's not how the universe is. It's how we experience the best of the objectiveness of the universe. And so I don't know if we ever conclude the metaphysics debate. What is the true nature of reality? Will we always be bound by our senses? Even experiments that we run objectively, we're still experiencing those experiments. So there's still an objective experience. Why do we all experience it the same way? It's because we're physically very, very similar. And the argument you could make is, well, hang on a sec. If you run an experiment and I run an experiment, why do they turn out the same? Because at our level, the differences in the macro is very, 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 very tiny. As an example, we cannot move towards the speed of light with the energy that we have or the way that our bodies are built right now. If we could, we would experience physics different. That is special relativity. So what I'm trying to say is the bounds of our subjectiveness is very, 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 very tiny between us humans, and therefore we will run the same type of experiments, and the objectiveness that we seek and find is always going to be very similar for us. I will make a part 2 on this. Let me have a bit more of a think. And I know this one was a little all over the place because this topic of objective and subjective, you could look at it through many lenses. You could look at it through any different field these days. And it's always going to be there because it's integrated in life. We cannot escape this. There is, as humans, no escaping the subjectiveness. And therefore, when anything happens that we think is objective, it's not really. And so we're kind of stuck in this mode. And I wish we could jump forward maybe 1 billion years if we survive that long. What's the next evolution physically? And why? Why is evolution evolving in the direction that it's evolving? That's a fascinating question. Why did we develop minds to evolve faster? We can think instantaneously about something different. I cannot physically jump from one location. Well, a very short jump, but I think you see what I'm saying. I'm always bound physically, but mentally I can take my mind anywhere. And that's an interesting aspect of evolution that's given us this power. One aspect to note, though, we didn't talk a lot about time. Time plays a very crucial role into anything we discuss, because without time, there wouldn't be anything. There's no universe without time. It'd just be static. And our brains give us the interpretation of our time. Our minds develop to be able to think about the future. What a powerful concept. The fact that we can plan is such a big, huge thing. Just thinking about tomorrow is an amazing attribute that we have evolved to have. Why did we evolve? I think it's actually to be able to attempt to predict the future, but that's a different story. So we use our minds for everything in terms of meaning and reasoning and thinking, yet it's still subjective. It feels objective. A thought feels objective. It's still subjective. So we're back to square one.